let's begin with the obvious. Stanford University, your alma mater, our university together, has a very special and central relationship to the digital revolution that has washed over all of our lives over the past 30 years. This is a graphic just from a recent issue of the Stanford Daily about the ways in which the evolution of Stanford as a university is almost inseparable from the rise of Silicon Valley and its preeminence within the interdependent global order, the extraordinary fortune of the university connected with the extraordinary fortune of Silicon Valley, now so closely intertwined. A study from a few years ago at the business school, we're sitting in one of the business school classrooms right now, noted that if you tallied up all of the startups and companies started by Stanford alumni, it would equal $3 trillion in economic impact every single year. There's a graph later in the story that says something like this: if the companies together were added up with their annual revenues, it would be something like the 11th or 12th largest country in the world by GDP, just from Stanford alumni. So that's just a small measure of how central this university is to Silicon Valley and the digital revolution. Now, anyone who's been only paying a small amount of attention, much less daily attention, to the news knows that the story is not all upside. And we're going to get to that less than fully rosy picture in a minute. But here's just a bit more stuff about Stanford. Over the course of the past decade, partly because of Mehron's extraordinary pedagogical skill and inventiveness in constructing a new version of the CS curriculum, CS, computer science curriculum. Computer science is the largest major at the university. It's the largest major for men. It's the largest major for women. And it's been a basic, steady uptick for the past 10 years, mirroring but exceeding the rise in CS majors elsewhere in the country. That's led to some snarky articles from East Coast publications that have labeled Stanford University "Get Rich You." And, the snark is real in the sense that it's capturing a little bit of something that I'll confess I see myself sometimes. As a philosopher, I've only recently begun spending time over in the engineering quad and getting to know computer science students. But I had the following experience a few years ago, which was teaching in the Thinking Matters program, the first-year curriculum for students on campus. Fall quarter, was getting to know some of the students, invited them to my office hours. Student came, I said, "Welcome, it's so great you're here. Tell me about yourself. What are you going to major in? What are you thinking of?" He said, 18 years old, "I can't wait to major in computer science. Next quarter, the venture capital class." I said, "That's so interesting, great. Like, what are your startup ideas?" And he said, "Well, professor, I'd happily tell you, but I'd first have to ask you to sign a non-disclosure agreement." I told him as a philosopher his secrets were safe with me. But in any case, that gives you a sense of the pre-professional orientation. You might as well make that a headline in the New Yorker as well. All right, so 2015, 2016 rolls around, Brexit, the Trump election, Cambridge Analytica, and the bloom is beginning to come off the rose of Silicon Valley. We're all now aware of algorithmic bias, of automation that displaces people from work, of privacy violations, of misinformation and disinformation in our news feeds, of hate speech that's algorithmically amplified, and on and on and on. So this was a headline from the New York Times a few years ago, just as we and people from other universities were coming together to try to integrate ethics, policy, and technical skills for us in a single class. To the best of our knowledge, this course that we now teach is the only one on campus in which you have to do technical assignments, policy memos, and philosophy papers all in the same class. Ethics not as a tick box that you get a one-off class and you're done, but integrating these different frameworks into the curriculum for computer science students, and importantly, also trying to bring technical skills to people who have policy aspirations so that people who aspire to work in public policy or in civil society organizations also have some technical skill, just as important as educating the CS students. The president of the university, when he arrived along with Provost Drell, initiated a long-range planning effort. Ethics and technology and science is one of the main long-range initiatives here at Stanford. And there's a growing awareness of the importance of this kind of work, not just that we're doing, but that many people here on campus are doing and on other campuses as well. So here's a little bit about the course that we launched. It's cross-listed in a whole bunch of places. It launched 3 years ago with about 300 students. We'll teach it again, hopefully for a large number of students this winter. After the first year, we brought the class into Silicon Valley and in a partnership with a venture capital firm in San Francisco, offered the class to people who work in tech companies. That seemed to go pretty well also. We were getting good, enthusiastic responses. And then over the pandemic, we decided now that we were successful in trying to reach undergrads, successful in trying to reach people who work in Silicon Valley, let's try to write a book together. And so that was what we spent a good part of the pandemic doing, with the result just coming out last month. Okay, I'm going to turn it over very soon to Meron to say something about the content of the book, but one more just sort of scene setting for you about Stanford. We have these case studies that are in the class. They're freely available on our website. This is just a sense of the curriculum we developed. But here's the scene setting I want to offer you. The kind of shift from techno-optimism to techno-pessimism, and what we think is now a new era out of techno-optimism and techno-pessimism. If you were on campus 30 years ago, especially if you were on campus majoring in computer science 30 years ago, you'll remember the extraordinary optimism, even utopianism, that went along with acquiring technical skills. Being a computer science major could be an effort in liberating humanity, spreading democracy, and unlocking human potential. Here's what Ronald Reagan said while he was president: "The Goliath of totalitarianism will be brought down by the David of the microchip." His successor, George Bush: "Imagine if the internet took hold in China. Imagine how freedom would spread." A sign of the rosy view of the technologies developed here. That's shifted over the past 5 years to the opposite pole. An Israeli historian and philosopher named Yuval Noah Harari has a book called 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, and he says the centralized architecture of artificial intelligence, massive data sets powered by extraordinary computing power, puts a thumb on the scale of assisting authoritarian regimes. Democracies are built on decentralization. AI is built on centralization. And so he concludes that technology favors tyranny. The completely opposite view from what we had a generation ago. So we think we're entering a new era in which it's neither pessimism nor optimism, but something more ordinary, and in that respect, much better. Technology delivers us extraordinary benefits, but it's also responsible for creating enormous social harms. And the task now in our new era is for all of us to play a role in shaping the technological future worth having so that we get the great benefits and mitigate or eliminate the harms. Last thing before I turn the floor over, I just want to give you a perspective that we want to avoid in the book, in the class, and here, which is to focus on whether or not we get good people or bad people, or good companies or bad companies. If only we can get good people to be in charge, then everything would be solved. The good people, bad people story is one that focuses on people like Elizabeth Holmes, the famous Stanford dropout, who is now standing trial, as I'm sure you all know, for Theranos, exposed by the Bad Blood book, the Wall Street Journal author. This is a story about personal ethics, and in that respect, not all that interesting. Does anyone seriously believe that Elizabeth Holmes had only had an ethics course at Stanford or in high school, this wouldn't have happened? People are flawed. They make mistakes. This might be an especially egregious mistake. But this is not an interesting ethical problem. There's no case in favor of lying, cheating, and deceiving. And so it doesn't seem to us worth spending a ton of time thinking about this. Slightly more interesting is the idea of whistleblowers. The whistleblower who partly exposed Elizabeth Holmes's fraud, or alleged fraud of the company, another Stanford grad, the grandson of George Shultz, who just recently passed away, and then this whistleblower, whom you know as well from paying attention to the news the past 2 weeks, Frances Haugen, the whistleblower from Facebook. That takes moral courage, and that's worth celebrating, but the idea of fixating on the moral compass of a founder, the goodness or badness of a company, is a mistake. Instead, we think you need to pay attention to the system, hence system error. And with that, I'll turn the floor over to Meron to talk about the book.
Thanks very much. So when we thought about, what are the reasons why we want to actually write a book, as Rob alluded to, we want to think about the societal consequences that come out of technology. And we've seen lots of positive impacts, but we've also seen lots of negative impacts the past few years, and it's important to take a realistic view as to some of the problems technology can solve and problems that it can exacerbate. And if we think about that, we need to understand what the systematic drivers are. That, as Rob mentioned, it's not about good people or bad people, good companies or bad companies, but there is a system that has particular constructions in it, and those constructions drive particular outcomes. And when we begin to unpack those, which we'll talk about shortly, you can begin to see some of the more systematic issues that we need to address if we want to actually achieve real solutions. And oftentimes what that means is we need to come up with something realistic where we're still getting the benefits of technology. We're just not saying we should walk away from technology. That's certainly not the goal, because there's tremendous benefits. As most of you probably witnessed during the pandemic, the reason why kids were still able to keep going to school, the reason why we were able to keep in touch with loved ones, was because we have a technological infrastructure that had made that possible. And that was an amazing thing. So we don't want to throw that away, but at the same time, we need to understand that it opens doors to particular harms that we need to be aware of. So what are these drivers when we think about actually unpacking some of what the system is? The first one is what we refer to as the optimization mindset. And as a technologist, one of the things that I've taught students for many years is you want to create efficient solutions, right? You want to try to solve problems more quickly. But that notion of trying to optimize spills over in a broader context in life. And what it oftentimes means in a business context is there's particular metrics or particular measures in your business that you are trying to drive forward, that you're trying to optimize in some sense. And sometimes what happens is those particular measures actually diverge a bit from sort of the stated mission of what you'd like to do. So let me give you a simple example. Facebook's stated mission is to connect the world. That seems like a very nice goal. But how do you actually measure connection in the world? Well, ways it gets done internally are things like measuring how much time people spend on the platform, how many pieces of content they interact with or click the like button on, and of course, how many ads they click through on and how much revenue that generates. The problem is the people just interacting with a piece of content doesn't mean you're creating connection in the world, because people might interact with a piece of content because they're angry, because they're upset, because they find that content potentially titillating or infuriating. So that measure by itself is not actually a reflection of what we want in the world. And when we try too hard to just think about optimizing these measures, because that's the only way we have to measure progress in a business, that's one of the places where we run into problems. The second is an obsession with scale, and is the notion that especially for smaller companies, to be able to scale quickly is a competitive advantage. The problem with doing that kind of relentless push towards scale is it oftentimes doesn't leave time to be able to think about what are unintended consequences. What are the negative societal externalities that come out of the technology, because one is so focused on what they only believe the good outcomes are and the measures they're actually looking at. And so you wrap that all up with a deliberate indifference from politicians that dates back to the mid-1990s when we had the Communications Decency Act in 1996 that actually helped create a regulatory oasis around technology by removing liability, for example, for content that's posted on platforms like social networks. The idea at the time was to help the internet blossom. If you remember, Al Gore invented the internet. That's part of the reason why he's credited for it, is because regulation at the time wanted to have innovation blossom. And it was a great thing. It worked really well. The problem is 25 years later, we're in the same regulatory regime when now we've seen these negative consequences, and it's time we need to do something about the system that brings all these things together. So in terms of thinking about some particular issues that come up in the book, to delve a little bit more deeply into what some of the problems are and externalities that we grapple with, one of them is around the notion of algorithmic decision-making, the fact that algorithms are now making more and more decisions in our lives, whether or not we know it. So for example, who gets access to financial credit, who gets a mortgage, who gets bail in the criminal justice system, who gets matched in dating applications, who get access to health care. All of those things are driven by algorithms now. So there's significant things in our life, our health, our financial well-being, our social lives. If we don't know that these are driven by algorithms and how those algorithms work, and the fact that those algorithms are based on historical data from human beings that may actually reflect human bias in that data, then we don't know that we're actually potentially perpetuating that bias under the guise of having objective algorithms, because the decision is being made by a computer. And really what those computers are doing is using AI or a particular technique, machine learning, which is to take vast troves of data, discover patterns in it, and then use those discovered patterns in some sense to make decisions about the future. And the problem is we have a history of lots of data that has in it human bias and all kinds of historical issues that are now getting encoded into algorithms. It even brings up the question, what is fair? And a simple example we give you in the book is if you consider the school system and you consider a certain budget, is it fair to have an equal amount of spending per student? Or do you then also consider the fact that some students have special needs and need more spending on them to be able to get to the same level of potential outcome? So those are two things that are both reasonable definitions of fairness, but we need to get into understanding what fairness is at a precise level if we want to encode it into algorithms and be able to get better outcomes. Another theme in the book is around data privacy and the notion of data maximization. And data maximization is just basically when platforms try to gather as much data as possible to then be able to infer patterns in it, because in the early days you may not know what patterns you're trying to infer. Well, you can imagine the trade-off is your personal privacy. And then there's lots of technologies built around privacy, for example, encryption, so that people can't look at your communication. But if you over-index too much on the notion of privacy because no one can see what you're saying, that also means that no one can see what human traffickers or child pornographers are saying either. And so there are value trade-offs built into these technologies we need to be aware of to understand that if you over-optimize on one value, there's other values you're losing in the process. The third theme in the book has to do with automation and artificial intelligence and what that means for potential job displacement in the future. So depending on who you talk to, you get lots of different estimates for the number of jobs that are impacted. It's estimated that somewhere between 9 and 47% of jobs, so pretty wide range, will be impacted by AI and automation in the next 10 years. So we're not talking about 50-year futures, we're talking about the current labor force. And if we want to deal with those impacts when we already see them coming down the road, how do we think about unpacking the systematic drivers and what sorts of policies we can put into place now, say around reskilling or education to prepare the workforce for the future before this wave just washes over them. The fourth big theme of the book is something you're probably all familiar with and something you're wondering, is it in the book? Well, it's in the book, is the discussion of free speech and democracy. The notion that if you look at large online platforms, they have a tremendous amount of power about who has access to free speech, what speech is regulated, and the fact that they're private platforms, which actually gives them a lot more control over speech rights than a public corporation might, because a public corporation would be more bound by the First Amendment. Now there's value trade-offs in that. Who gets to make that decision? Why is that decision now in the hands of a few tech executives at these large companies, rather than sort of being in the hands of our democratic process? That's a result of regulation that Jeremy will talk about more, so I'm not going to steal his thunder. But it has an impact on our democracy. And what that means is when we think about at the broader level the impact of these technologies on our lives, it's not just about personal decisions that's being made for us, it's not just about the larger labor force, but it in fact impacts the very structure of our government and how we view ourselves as a society. So with that said, I'll turn it over to Jeremy.
So one of the things that motivated all three of us was a sense that we felt among students, among professional technologists, among our family members and relatives, among people that we engaged with, that the orientation towards technology's effects on society was one of passivity, right? What is it that we can possibly do in the face of new technologies, in the face of the concentrated power in large technology companies, to achieve the kind of social outcomes we want? But instead, what we saw is that people feel like technology's effects are like a wave that washes over them, that washes over society. And that's true not only for people who are outside of technology companies, but we were stunned to see that same passivity among undergraduates who were headed on this pipeline into big tech, or even among professional technologists. And so at the center of the teaching that we do, but also of the book, is to challenge that framework of passivity and to suggest that the technological future that we want is actually in our control, but only if we begin to exercise agency, right? That is, the effects of technology on society are a function of how we build technology, how we decide to integrate technology into human processes and what steps that we take as a society to mitigate the potential harms of technology. And so there's extraordinary room for agency in this process, but agency that up until now has largely been left untapped. Now, of course, from the perspective of large tech companies, they've offered citizens and consumers a choice, right? The choice looks something like this. Engage with the extraordinary products that we provide with their benefits and their potential harms, or go off the grid, right? Delete Facebook, get rid of Uber and Lyft, reject the use of the video conferencing platform if you're not happy with the privacy policies. And so there's an orientation to treat all of us as consumers as if this underlying infrastructure that's being built, that's generating the kinds of social harms that Meron described, is something that you could walk away from. You could move to Nevada, to Burning Man, right? And you could live there off the grid, right? As if that is a functional solution for most people. And the reality is that it isn't. And so while there are things, of course, that all of us can do to kind of address some of the values that are being traded off, if you care about privacy, you can adjust the privacy settings on this platform if you can find your way to the privacy settings on the platform, right? You can use DuckDuckGo instead of Google search if you don't want your data to be monetized and used in a way that enables advertisers to target you. You can switch away from Gmail if you don't want Google reading all of your email to target ads that head toward you. So there are lots of things that you can do. But when it comes to thinking about the social harms of tech, individual behavior isn't going to be enough, right? Because ultimately, the kinds of social effects that Meron was describing, right? The implications of the use of algorithmic decision-making for fairness and due process and justice in society, or the implications of the advent of AI and the way in which it's automating work and the consequences for people's ability to earn a living, right? Or the power of the platforms that provide extraordinary access to amplify your speech, but also create risks with respect to the protection of people's individual dignity in the face of toxic speech, or the quality of our democracy because of misinformation. These are systemic effects, and they require systemic solutions. That is, the individual steps that we could take are really not going to address these social harms. And we often talk about this through the lens of the roadway system, right? When cars were being invented, it's an extraordinary transformation in how we engage in the world. But as people experienced the potential danger of cars, it wasn't just go out and drive, see if you can avoid getting hit. And if you'd prefer not to drive, stay on your horse, right? No, instead we looked at that moment with a different lens. And we said that we need stoplights, we need roadways, we need lanes, we need bike lanes, we need speed bumps near schools. We architected a system. Some people would use the word regulation. I know it can be a bad word on this side of the country, but we took the set of collective goals that we had as a society and we turned them into a set of guardrails around technology. And so the final part of the book and the kind of exercise that we engage in with our students is to think about what are the levers for change that help us amplify the benefits of technology but also mitigate the harms. And we focus in particular on three different sort of sources of power and influence over the tech ecosystem and its effects. The first is, what does it mean to cultivate an ethic of responsibility among technologists, right? How do we look at the profession of computer science as a subset of engineering and think about what are the ethical and social obligations of technologists, not just to the bottom line of their companies, but to the societies in which they live? And you might say, well, do we have ethics of responsibility that govern other fields? Well, of course we do, right? The transformation that happened in medicine from the quackery of 100 years ago to the regulatory architecture that now governs how medicines that come into our body, medical devices that are used, but also even the individual obligations of doctors, all of that are a set of social norms and professional obligations that we've created, right? The same exists around law. The same is even in evidence in fields like bioengineering, where with the advent of CRISPR, gene editing technologies, scientists came together to begin to draw lines about what was socially acceptable for the use of these powerful technologies and what isn't. And so constructing a more mature tech sector that thinks seriously about its ethical and social obligations is one critical lever. And of course, the course and the teaching that we do of professional technologists in the evening is all about this. The second is addressing this moment that we're in, which we've seen repeatedly over time with the advent of new technologies, of the concentration of power in a small number of companies. And the danger of that concentration of power, not only because of its implications for consumer choice, which is the traditional framework on antitrust, but also the effects on our political system of that concentrated power, given the way in which our political system is architected. And so we're obviously at the moment, an opening moment, a policy window is the way political scientists would call it, for new perspectives on sort of how technology companies should be governed. And so you see that with the antitrust orientation in Europe, but also in the United States. But some of the checking of the power of companies is actually coming from below and not just from above. It's coming from technologists themselves who are exercising their agency inside companies, asking their leadership hard questions about to whom products should be sold, for what problems should technology be developed, whose voice needs to be at the table in technology companies to ensure that technology itself is responsive to the needs of society. And then the final piece of the puzzle, and this is both a near-term challenge but also a long-term challenge, is to get our democracy into the game. Because as Meron described, if you're unhappy with the social consequences of technology, it's not just Mark Zuckerberg to blame, right? It's a failure of our political institutions to begin to recognize these social effects and to begin to take steps through policy and regulation to address these harms. And so the moment that we're in now in Washington and more broadly around the world is one in which harms around privacy, around the lack of transparency, around algorithms, about issues of content moderation or upskilling to address the effects of automation. There's no shortage of potential legislation to address the harms that we know about. And we, the three of us, feel relatively optimistic that we're at the beginning of a policy window that's really going to begin to build these guardrails around technology. But of course, the big challenge, and we know this sitting out in California instead of Washington, D.C., is that the problems of the future are the ones that we need to be preparing for. And we don't even know what that next generation of technology is going to look like. In the book, we write about these large language models, GPT-3. When we go to Washington and talk about large language models, no one has ever heard of them. But out here, everyone's talking about large language models. Models that basically learn from all of the text that's ever been created and can generate speech, right? At large scale and quickly, that's 100% believable, right? We generated blurbs for our book by typing into GPT-3. 3 professors at Stanford wrote a book about the effects of technology on society, a philosopher, a social scientist, and a computer scientist. And this is what people said about the book. And we got quotes from Bill Gates and Mike Bloomberg and Darren Walker at the Ford Foundation, who actually blurbed our book. And they were excellent blurbs. We wanted to use them, right? But none of them were true. And so these are incredibly powerful technologies, and we need a set of democratic institutions that are capable looking forward and not just looking back. And what does that mean? That means thinking about who's attracted to work into government. How do we think about the roles of scientific and technical expertise in our public institutions? How do we think about regulation in much more experimental, flexible, and adaptable ways? Because if we look back over the last 130 years, regulatory cycles happen once every 30 years when it comes to changes in our telecommunications architecture. But the kinds of harms that have been built up over the last 25 years with respect to technology are so significant in many domains that we don't want to contemplate this long waiting period. And so we need to rethink how our democratic institutions are structured as well. And so with that, I'm going to bring Meron back up to the stage, and we're going to put you to work. Because it's a class without quizzes, but it doesn't mean that we don't want to take advantage of this opportunity to get you thinking. Because one of the most important things that we're doing with the book and with the classes that we teach is not offering people the answers to these problems, because there are no right or wrong answers to how we weigh and referee value trade-offs around technology. There's only the process of deliberating about the trade-offs, and so we're going to get you deliberating about some of these trade-offs now.
What we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about was a particular technology that many of you are probably familiar with that actually has many of its roots right here at Stanford, and that's automated vehicles. So a few years back, there was this little car. This one's actually called Junior, which was the second generation. It was built to run basically a race out in the Mojave Desert autonomously. It was a 120-mile race. And I'll just show you, actually, the first generation was the race in the desert. The second generation was to be able to drive in an urban environment. And I'll show you a little video of that. So this is actually being controlled by a computer. Comes to a stop sign, needs to recognize that it's a stop sign, has its blinker on, very safe, and then it goes through the intersection when it recognizes there's no other cars there. The humans, of course, are all behind concrete bunkers. That doesn't happen in the real world. So here it is coming to a stop sign. At this point, it needs to recognize there's a stop sign. It also needs to recognize there's other cars there, and it needs to reason about the rules of the road that says it needs to understand when other cars have cleared the intersection and when it's its turn to go, and then drive through the intersection, which means applying acceleration, turning the steering wheel, as the case may be. And so finally, it's its turn to go, and so it cautiously goes through the intersection. What does this look like from the computer standpoint? So what this is a little map that basically shows in red. You can see where there's kind of blocks being picked up by its various sensors. It sees that certain sets of blocks actually comprise cars, and when those cars clear the intersection, it puts a green square there to indicate it knew there was a car there, and that car cleared the intersection, so it can reason about its turn to go in that intersection. And then eventually, when it becomes its turn to go, you can see another car is pulled up top in the meantime, although that lane is already car had already gone through, so it's its turn. It applies acceleration and goes through the intersection. Okay? I'll show you another example where it's coming to that same intersection and no one's there. It needs to recognize no one's there and say, hey, it's my turn to go, and just go through. So it needs to be adaptable to real-world situations of whatever it's going on. Here's another case I'll show you briefly where I was trying to go through this path in the road. You can see there's a bunch of red up there. Those are just blocks. We don't know if that's people crossing the street or if there's construction, but basically it realizes it can't go through that way. And so basically it's doing the equivalent of what we'd like to think is a 3-point turn, but we'll really call it an n-point turn for n greater than 3. But eventually it'll turn around and it'll replan another path and go on its merry way. And so the basic idea here is the computer is making these kinds of decisions and setting up the possibility for cars to drive themselves in the future. And as a matter of fact, Sebastian Thrun, who was a professor here at the time and was leading this project, said it's a no-brainer that 50 to 60 years from now, cars will drive themselves. And the time he made this quote, this was about 10 years ago, 2011, people thought that was way too aggressive of a time estimate. Really, it's only be 50 or 60 years? Well, it turns out just the next year, Nevada became the first state to issue a license for an autonomous vehicle, because if you're going to have autonomous vehicles on the road, presumably they should be licensed. Anyone here from Nevada? Yeah, one. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for being the shock troops for us. But if you're worried about this, California, just a couple of years later, passed similar regulation. And the basic idea is right here, in 2015 is one of the early Google self-driving cars in Mountain View, California. That project's now been spun out into a separate company called Waymo. But these are just steps in a process of automation that's been going on for years. And as a matter of fact, for a long time we had no automation. That's what's referred to as level 0 automation. And level 1 automation is probably something the vast majority of you have in your cars if you drive, which are things like cruise control or lane keeping, basic sensors in the car that help you maintain your speed or help you maintain, a particular kind of directionality. What we've now gotten to in the last decade or so are higher levels. So level 2 automation is the notion of partial automation, such as directional and speed control simultaneously. So if you have a Tesla and you use autopilot, this is kind of the idea. You're supposed to remain engaged, hands on the steering wheel. Remember 2 o'clock and 10 o'clock. I still remember that from being 15 and getting the permit. But that was partial automation, or is partial automation. But if we bump it up from there, the next level is what's known as conditional automation, which is sustained driving by the vehicle, but the human needs to be in there, being able to intervene at any time. And the question is, well, how well does that actually work out? And if we ask ourselves how well that actually works out, let me show you a little video, because Google did this experiment. So here are self-driving cars that they had that were driving from Google headquarters to Lake Tahoe and back. The person's supposed to remain engaged, right? So if anything happens, they're supposed to be able to jump right in. They're texting, yeah, this is a good idea to charge my phone, figure out what's going on, at 66 miles an hour down the road, by the way. Great time for makeup. You're running late for work. You know, that's fantastic. The car will just drive itself, but good luck if something happens and the car actually needs to swerve. This one, you can say, he's paying attention, except his face is blurred out. He's asleep. He's hurtling down the road at 55 miles an hour. Okay? He is not ready to take control of the car, and as a matter of fact, when this was seen as the net result of level 3 automation, lots of companies said, we will not release a car with this level of automation because the humans aren't prepared to properly interact with the technology. So the place that's trying to get to is level 4 automation, which in some locales is pretty close, which is fully autonomous driving in certain conditions, such as well-mapped areas at daytime. So some Waymo cars and some other manufacturers' cars can do this now. There are automated taxi services, for example, that will pick people up and drive them off. And the eventual goal is level 5, which is fully autonomous driving under any conditions. Some people actually argue that in these kinds of situations, we shouldn't even have a steering wheel in the car because the computer will be safer than human beings, and we'll screw it up if we actually grab the wheel. So with that as a backdrop for sort of the relentless advance of technology, we can think about what are the potential positives of this technology. I'll turn that over to Rob, and that'll lead further into the case study.
All right, well, as Maron just said, it turns out humans are really bad drivers. In fact, road accidents are one of the largest causes of death and injury in the world. There's the data from 2017. Road injuries is in the top 10. Same in the United States, same in China, even higher in China. So, of course, the optimistic thought here is that if we should be able to develop autonomous vehicles in a way that improves upon the relatively bad record of human driving, that will be an incredible benefit for human well-being. And that's the kind of story that many of the car companies tell that are developing this. Now keep in mind, when it comes to those injuries on the roadways, it's not just the passengers in the car who are at risk. Those data tally people who are pedestrians on or near the roadway, plus bicyclists, plus motorcyclists. Notice that bicyclists, the top green one up there, relatively small proportion of injuries. Pedestrians is actually as large as or slightly greater than people in the car. And when you think about the benefits, potential benefits of automation, keep in mind those 4 rough categories: bicyclists, motorcyclists, people in the car, and then pedestrians. The case here, of course, is that there are big benefits. And you can get headlines that say things like self-driving vehicles in the United States could save up to 300,000 lives per decade just in the United States. And of course, it's not just automobiles. The same is true for things like computer vision that can detect cancer far earlier than human beings can from observing scans. Lots of different places for the extraordinary benefits that automation and artificial intelligence can deliver. But here's where we want to get into a discussion with you. The hard questions about value trade-offs that don't register in right and wrong, true and false, but better and worse. Here is a lamentable early fact. So we are told the evidence shows that when you do pilots of autonomous vehicles on the roadway, you get really good benefits relative to human drivers. It increases the safety of people in the car. It increases the safety of pedestrians. It increases the safety of motorcyclists. But it's slightly more dangerous for bicyclists. If you keep this in mind, if we put autonomous vehicles on the roadways now, don't change the roadway infrastructure, average human well-being will go up. Because if we're better off for passengers, pedestrians, and motorcyclists, we get pretty big benefits. However, current early data shows that bicyclists are slightly worse off. So if you work for a car company, if you are a bicyclist, if you work for a public policy agency, if you're just an ordinary citizen, what should we do? Should we release autonomous vehicles sooner rather than later, even knowing that bicyclists are slightly worse off, but of course also expecting that overall we'll get a big benefit? Or should we wait somehow until it improves the average safety of that additional category of bicyclists? Take your location, citizen, person in a car company, person working in government, civil society. Think about just your own preferences. If you could snap your fingers, what would you want them to do? But let's just quickly do a poll. If you're in favor of releasing the cars even though bicyclists are slightly worse off, raise your hand. All right, I'm going to guess like a third, maybe a little bit more. If you are against that and you think they should only be released once bicyclists are also slightly better off or better, raise your hand. All right, you see the roughly speaking equal distribution. Those of you who didn't raise your hand presumably have some other thing in mind. Now, of course, one thing that comes along here is, all right, well, maybe they shouldn't be released until they fix the roadways. Then the question is, well, who pays for that? The car companies that want to release them? The people who are on the bicycles? Tax the bicyclists to have the infrastructure rebuilt for them. All right, we're going to move on to Jeremy so you get a chance to debate a second problem.
Okay, so this gives you a sense of the kind of deliberation and engagement that we're trying to create with undergraduates. So I'm going to take you to a second thing on which we need to deliberate. So you've got autonomous vehicles. They have these extraordinary potential benefits, but also they can harm people, right? These are very powerful instruments for causing harm. And if you're the head of an autonomous vehicle company, you have to decide, where am I going to test these vehicles in real-world settings? And say you're an autonomous vehicle company that's headquartered in California. Well, California likes to regulate, right? California likes to legislate. People have a lot of preferences in California that are reflected out of what comes out of Sacramento. So the perspective of autonomous vehicle companies looking at Sacramento might be, California is not an ideal environment in which to test these vehicles in real-world settings as quickly as we need to in order to make progress. So you're head of an AV company and Governor Doug Ducey calls you. Anyone here from Arizona, right? Thanks so much. Arizona, also a testing ground. Doug Ducey says, come to Arizona. Great place to locate your business. No constraints with respect to rolling out autonomous vehicles. You can learn as quickly as possible about how these vehicles interact with human drivers, with human pedestrians, with bicyclists. Arizona is your place to innovate and learn. So, what I want you to deliberate about for a minute or two is, would you move your testing from California to Arizona? California has expressed preferences about the kinds of constraints on testing that need to be set in place in order to balance the innovation potential of these vehicles with the potential harms. Arizona comes along and says, we're going to give you a regulatory oasis. Do you go to Arizona? That's question number one. Question number two is, does it matter to you as a corporate leader whether the offer is coming from Doug Ducey, the governor of Arizona, on his own, or whether Ducey has consulted with the state legislature in Arizona to provide a framework for the testing of these vehicles? I want you to raise your hand high and proud if you are headed to Arizona to test this technology, okay? Now, I want you to keep your hand up. Keep that up if you're headed to Arizona, just so we know, who's headed in that direction. Okay, now I want you to keep your hand up if you're willing to go, even if this was Doug Ducey acting on his own. Doesn't matter to you if the legislature's involved. Okay, so most hands stayed up. Okay. So here I take that to be a perspective that, like, regulations are not always well informed, right? And we know that to be the case, right? Part of the story that we were telling earlier is it's like easy to blame democracy for screwing it up, but that's also on us, right? Our government looks the way it does because we've let it get that way. Part of the story we tell in the book is how scientific and technical expertise disappeared from Washington, right? Deliberate decisions made in particular around 1994, right, in the contract with America to destroy institutions of technical expertise that were guiding our government. The question comes from exactly the source of what we're trying to generate in the class, which is deliberation about competing values, right, and competing preferences. And the fact that in the technological frontiers, these values, whether it's a value towards innovation, a value towards preventing harm, specific harms that people might be concerned about, so many of these decisions are actually being made inside companies and not in our politics. The virtue of what's happening in the EU context is that political processes, we talk about this in the book as the technology of democracy. Democracy as a technology is not good for optimizing for the best outcome, but that's not what it was designed for. It was designed to referee in a collective political community our disagreements about what we want, right? And ultimately, leaving it up to technologists, leaving it up to CEOs to referee those value trade-offs is doing a disservice given the kinds of harms that we're seeing. I want to just tell you the end of this story, right? The end of this story is Ducey does invite the AV companies into Arizona. AVs are on the road. They kill, unfortunately, a pedestrian, right? What happens? People begin to attack the AVs with hammers and 2x4s and rocks. And the regulatory framework that was set up by the governor to bring people in faces the backlash from citizens that felt that their voices were not reflected. So this is why the issues that we put on the table for you today are so important and why it's so essential for Stanford not only to kind of cultivate in our young technologists and our young humanists and our young social scientists an orientation towards recognizing responsibilities that go beyond the construction of products, but also for all of us to get out of the passive orientation towards technology's effects on society to say, this is something I don't understand, let's leave it in the hands of the experts, because ultimately the consequences are felt by all of us.